It's sort of like he got in the zone. And he'd done really great work before then, don't get me wrong. But it's sort of like at that point, he was so self-assured and so, in the zone, in his own, comfortable in his own skin. And then he got to a point, I think, after Slapshot, and you mentioned The Verdict, which was a very challenging film. In fact, Robert Redford, some of you may know, was originally cast or originally offered the role. And Redford finally passed on it because he just couldn't get that dark, he felt. And it's sort of like there's certain actors who reach a point, it's beyond being in the zone. It's like, I can do anything. That's one of the great things about being old. I mean, what are they going to do? Come and take the awards away from me? And that extraordinary body of work, say from The Verdict on, where you really got the feeling that he was always a character actor in a leading man's body, and like the character actor took over. And the film we're going to show here tonight, Nobody's Fool, really remarkable, unembellished, unaffected, no frills piece of work that is straight from the heart. And I don't think an actor who wasn't that self-assured, that confident, could have pulled something like that off.
Yeah, I think he did. It's interesting to talk about Newman and Redford together, since they were in two movies together, and they were both big movies, and there was always talk, will there be another Newman-Redford project? Could there be another one? And as actors, not necessarily, because I think Redford has an adventurous side as a director, but I think Redford a much more cautious, image-conscious guy than Newman, who was able to sort of let go of his own, physical, I was going to say beauty, maybe that's what it was, and play all kinds of roles. And he didn't feel like he had to protect himself. And I think much less vain actor than Redford, who saved most of his sort of adventurous moves for when he moved behind the camera. So they were just an interesting parallel in the way two people sort of, their careers grew. So I think Newman did not have much in the way of self-regard or need to protect himself or preserve himself as the relic of, male handsomeness.
But at the same time, and this sounds like I'm contradicting everything we've just talked about, but what I suggested, the name for this discussion, Paul Newman, the last movie star, I didn't mean this altogether facetiously, because there is something, and I keep saying present tense, I still don't want to admit he's gone, and like I say, he's not gone. His movies are always going to be around, so he's always going to be in the present tense, but the idea that there was still something of a carryover from the golden age of Hollywood stardom about him, in the sense that, Paul Newman didn't do the talk show circuit. I mean, if Paul Newman appeared on a late night chat show, it was like an event, and it was usually like a joke, like the thing he did on was it David Letterman's first show on CBS, where he got up in the audience and said, "Where's the damn singing cats?" He thought he was going to see Cats on Broadway. But you didn't see him on Entertainment Tonight. You didn't see him in the supermarket tabloids. There was, for all his, charity work, for all his, going out and doing, racing NASCAR, there was still something a little bit withheld. There was always something a little bit, not necessarily in his acting, you understand, but I mean, like, the public Paul Newman was never rude, but he was never this constant need to constantly be in the spotlight and to constantly be fawned over, or people trying to find scandals about him. And he lived a very simple life with Joanne Woodward for so many years.
Yeah, I think it's also, in line with what you're saying, significant that he didn't live in Los Angeles. He lived in Connecticut, and they once in a while they did things in the theater, and they would, he had his business, which he seemed to view sort of whimsically, the food business, which I guess mostly was run by his daughter. But he yeah, I think he kept a distance between himself and movies and Hollywood and the public, and probably was a happier man for it.
And you know, the one real great tragedy was like losing his son to drugs. You know, he sort of turned that around into, you know, this philanthropic concern of, you know, doing work, you know, anti-drug, you know, commercials and things like that. But, you know, that wasn't something he ever really discussed very much. He didn't feel the need to do one of these soul-bearing interviews for Oprah or, you know, or Barbara Walters or anything like that. And you kind of had to respect that about him. And I think you'll agree with me, he was a notoriously difficult interview. I mean, it's like the idea of having to sell the movie was part of the job. But, you know, even with something like Blaze on that junket, I remember him showing up Sunday morning for the group, the roundtables at the UN Hotel in New York. And once again, I think that, I don't think he was 3 sheets to the wind, but I mean, he just really, you know, he may have interrupted his drinking the night before to sleep for a while. You know, and he was more interested in talking about, you know, the fact that, you know, Earl Long, you know, the character that he played so memorably in Blaze, had been hounded by the press going into his private life. And Newman apparently had been very, you know, turned off by, at the time, or recent presidential election, reporters going into various, you know, presidential candidates' lives and finding scandals. And he didn't think that this was something that they had any right to do. And he couldn't help but feel, while he was saying this about, you know, contemporary politicians and Earl Long, he was really talking about himself. The idea that, you know, with his case, he was much more fortunate than, you know, any presidential candidate caught, you know, with a chippy on his eye or anything like that. But there was no scandal there.
I think, you know, in Nobody's Fool, is maybe a good case in point, and in other movies, Perdition comes to mind. It's funny you mentioned his son's death and his response to that. And, you know, I think Newman was a guy who knew how to live with pain. And you could see that sometimes in the screen, that he was a guy who he knew how to keep things in and under control. But just before we came over here, I was doing a podcast interview with Bill Pullman, and we finished that. And I said to him, well, he said, where are you going? I said, going over to the film center to do this thing about Paul Newman and so on. What do you think of Newman? And he had an interesting take. He said, you know, he said, and he brought up Newman's interest in race car driving. And he said, Newman seemed to me, and he didn't know him, hadn't worked with him, but he was always observing pretty much like a moviegoer, said to me, a very controlled and precise kind of guy in terms of his acting. And yet, he did this crazy risk thing, driving race cars. And he thought that something about that combination was interesting to him and possibly meaningful, although he wasn't sure exactly what it said about him.
Well, also, and this is something I once again never discussed with him himself, but, you know, I discussed with Brian Dennehy, who was wounded in action during Vietnam. I talked